the United States Armed Forces conducted an extraordinary military operation in the capital of Venezuela.
7 days. It took exactly 7 days for Donald Trump to commit one of the most stupid and costly geopolitical errors of his presidency. And believe me, the competition is fierce. But what he's just triggered in Venezuela is going to backfire on him in such a spectacular, predictable, and perfectly avoidable way that foreign policy analysts around the world are wondering if there's still anyone in the White House capable of reading a map or opening a history book. Because here's the raw truth. The all-out offensive Trump has just launched against Maduro's regime, maximum sanctions, aggressive recognition of the opposition, barely veiled military threats, and now credible reports of American Special Forces deployments at the Colombian and Brazilian borders, isn't just a bad idea. It's an unhoped-for strategic gift to China, Russia, and Iran. It's political suicide that will blow up in his face before the midterms. And it's a humanitarian catastrophe in the making that will make the current migration crisis look like a walk in the park. Let me explain exactly why Trump is committing the geopolitical equivalent of amputating his foot to cure an ingrown toenail. Trump looks at Venezuela and sees what he's always seen in foreign policy: a simple problem with an obvious muscular solution. Maduro is an incompetent dictator who has ruined his country. His regime is weak, the economy is in tatters, the military is demoralized. A little American pressure, some well-placed sanctions, maybe a surgical military operation, and boom, the regime collapses, democracy triumphs. Trump has his easy foreign policy victory to sell to voters. That's exactly what his team sold him. Marco Rubio, now Secretary of State, has been pushing this line for years. Venezuelan exiles in Miami, a crucial voting bloc in Florida, are applauding. The remaining neoconservatives in Washington dream of a new liberation to add to their resume. Everyone in his bubble tells him it's winnable, quick, clean. They're all wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Venezuela isn't Grenada in 1983 or Panama in 1989. Two of this gang of ideologues' favorite historical references. It's a country of 28 million inhabitants with hostile geography, armed forces still substantial despite corruption, and above all, international patrons extremely motivated to prevent a Washington-backed regime change. But the problem doesn't even start there. The problem begins with Trump's fundamentally flawed understanding of why Maduro is still in power. Maduro should have fallen 5 years ago. The Venezuelan economy has contracted by more than 75% since 2013. Hyperinflation has reached levels never seen outside Mugabe's Zimbabwe. 7 million Venezuelans, a quarter of the population, have fled the country. Hospitals have no medicine. Supermarkets are empty. Electricity is intermittent. It's a completely bankrupt state. And yet the regime holds. Not because Maduro is a political genius. Not because Chavismo retains massive popular support. The regime holds because it has built over the years a survival system specifically designed to resist American pressure. First, there's the power structure. Maduro doesn't govern alone. He's the facade of a complex network of generals, militia chiefs, drug traffickers, and corrupt oligarchs who all have infinitely more to lose from regime change than Maduro himself. These people aren't going into peaceful golden exile if the regime falls. They're going to The Hague or to American prisons. Their fortunes are seized. Their networks are dismantled. Their choice is simple: fight to the end or finish their days in prison. That's what Trump and his team don't understand. They think they're targeting Maduro. In reality, they're cementing the unity of a corrupt elite that knows defeat means annihilation. Then there are the international patrons. And this is where Trump's mistake becomes really costly. China has invested more than $60 billion in Venezuela over the past 15 years, not out of charity, to secure the largest oil reserves on the planet and establish a strategic foothold in America's backyard. Caracas already owes more than $20 billion to Beijing in unpaid loans alone. Do you seriously think Xi Jinping is going to calmly watch Washington install a pro-American regime in Venezuela and give up these investments? Abandon this geostrategic position without reacting? The last 48 hours have given the answer. Beijing just announced a new aid package of $5 billion to Caracas. Food aid, medicine, military spare parts. 2 Chinese warships are en route to La Guaira under the pretext of joint naval exercises. Additional Chinese military advisors have been deployed to reinforce Venezuelan air defense systems. The message is crystal clear. Touch Venezuela and you touch Chinese interests. Are you ready to risk a direct confrontation with Beijing to overthrow Maduro? And meanwhile, Moscow is rubbing its hands. Russia has already had military forces in Venezuela for years, officially technical advisors, in reality special forces units, and electronic warfare specialists. Putin uses Venezuela exactly as the United States used West Berlin during the Cold War. A symbolic provocation, a demonstration of power, a test of will. Every additional sanction Trump imposes, every threat he utters, strengthens Putin's position. He can play the protector of Venezuela against American aggression. He can sell even more weapons to Caracas, weapons paid for with Venezuelan gold since the country has no more currency. And above all, he can tie up American resources in Latin America while he himself operates freely in Ukraine and the Middle East. Trump thinks he's pressuring Maduro. In reality, he's offering China and Russia the perfect opportunity to do exactly what they do best: exploit American clumsiness to extend their influence. But suppose for a moment that Trump decides to ignore these realities and move to military action. The hawks in his administration whisper in his ear that it's doable. A quick operation. Decapitate the regime. The Venezuelan military will surrender without fighting. The people will welcome us as liberators. We've heard this song before. It was called Iraq 2003, and we all know what happened next. First, the Venezuelan military won't collapse as easily. Yes, it's corrupt, poorly equipped, undermined by low morale, but it still has 350,000 men under arms plus 1.6 million militiamen. Those famous Bolivarian militias created precisely to wage asymmetric warfare against foreign intervention. These militias aren't professional soldiers. They're urban guerrillas trained by Cubans and Iranians for years specifically to turn every Venezuelan city into Stalingrad if necessary. They know the terrain. They have weapon caches hidden everywhere. And above all, they have nowhere to go. Imagine American forces trying to secure Caracas, a chaotic metropolis of 3 million inhabitants built in a mountainous valley with endless slums where every street can become an ambush. Imagine them trying to control a country the size of Texas with destroyed infrastructure, no reliable local allies, facing an insurgency fed by Chinese and Russian weapons. American casualties would be heavy. Not catastrophic like in Iraq perhaps, but significant enough to turn American public opinion. And American public opinion, after 20 years of wars in the Middle East, has absolutely no desire for a new military adventure in Latin America. The last serious poll on the subject showed that 68% of Americans oppose military intervention in Venezuela. 68%. That's a massive bipartisan consensus that Trump is about to ignore. But even if Trump doesn't go as far as total invasion, even if he limits himself to draconian sanctions and covert operations, he's going to create a humanitarian disaster that will make the current migration crisis pale. 7 million Venezuelans have already fled the country. Colombia hosts 2.5 million. Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Brazil, all are collapsing under the weight of refugees. These countries' social infrastructures are at breaking point. Xenophobic tensions are exploding. The newly elected right-wing governments in the region won partly by promising to control Venezuelan immigration. And Trump thinks tightening sanctions will improve the situation? Targeted sanctions make sense when they isolate specific individuals. The widespread sanctions Trump is imposing hit the entire economy. They don't bring down Maduro.
The Trump administration claims the first phase of US dominance over Venezuela's oil reserves is underway.
20 years of Cuban experience prove that authoritarian regimes know how to survive sanctions, but they starve the population. Each additional turn of the screw will push hundreds of thousands more Venezuelans onto the roads. And guess where they'll end up? Not in China, not in Russia. They'll head north, through Central America, to Mexico, to the American border. Trump has made immigration his political battle horse. He built his career on the promise to secure the southern border. And now, he's deliberately creating a migration wave that will make the 2018 caravan insignificant by comparison. The numbers are already terrifying. NGOs on the ground estimate that if the economic situation in Venezuela continues to deteriorate at the current pace, and the new sanctions guarantee this deterioration, we could see 3 to 5 million additional Venezuelans flee in the next 18 months. You want to see Fox News explain to its voter base why there are suddenly tens of thousands of additional migrants at the gates of Texas and Arizona? Good luck. And then there's the regional impact, which Trump's team seems to have completely ignored in its calculation. Latin America in 2025 is no longer Washington's playground of the 1980s. Left-wing and right-wing governments in the region have learned to deeply distrust American interventionism. Even countries that hate Maduro, and there are many, don't want to see the United States dictate regime change by force. Lula's Brazil has already clearly expressed its opposition to any American military action. Sheinbaum's Mexico has recalled its traditional principles of non-intervention. Petro's Colombia, despite its own problems with Caracas, refuses to serve as a rear base for an American operation. Even Chile and Argentina, governed by conservative presidents, have expressed their concern about American escalation. Trump is achieving the impossible, unifying Latin America against the United States. The left because it opposes Yankee imperialism on principle. The right because it doesn't want to be associated with a military fiasco that could bring it down. The result? Washington's diplomatic isolation in its own region. The end of decades of patiently built influence, and an open door for Chinese influence, which will present itself as the reasonable and non-interventionist alternative to the United States. You want to know what strategic defeat looks like? This is exactly it. But let's return to the United States, because that's where Trump is really going to feel his Venezuelan mistake. He sold this policy to Florida voters. Venezuelan Americans in Miami voted for him massively in 2024, partly because he promised to be tough on Maduro. Perfect. They have their hard line. Now what? Because these same Venezuelan American voters have families in Venezuela. Cousins, parents, friends who are suffering. And when sanctions intensify, when the humanitarian situation worsens, when their loved ones call to tell them they can't find food or medicine anymore, the hard line starts to look like cruelty. The political calculation that seemed so obvious, being tough on Maduro equals winning votes, will turn around brutally. Because being tough on Maduro in the abstract is popular, but starving Venezuela until my uncle dies of diabetes for lack of insulin is much less so. And then there's the oil price. Because yes, even after years of sanctions, Venezuelan oil still matters. Venezuela still produces about 800,000 barrels per day, far from the 3 million before Chavismo, but enough to impact global markets in an already tense context. The new sanctions will remove this oil from the market. In a context where OPEC Plus is already limiting production, where tensions in the Middle East are driving up prices, where global economic recovery is increasing demand. Predictable result? Gas prices in the United States will increase. Not dramatically, maybe 15 to 20 cents per gallon, but enough for every average American to feel it at every fill-up. And guess who will be held responsible? The president who decided to sanction an oil producer for reasons 90% of Americans don't even understand. Trump thinks he's winning in Florida. He'll lose in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all the swing states where gas prices are a major electoral factor. But let's be generous for a moment. Suppose that despite all these obstacles, Trump actually succeeds in overthrowing Maduro. The opposition takes power. Democracy is restored. Total victory, right? Absolutely not, because post-Maduro Venezuela would be an even worse nightmare to manage. The country is destroyed. The economy must be entirely rebuilt. Institutions are non-existent. The security apparatus is infiltrated by criminals. Armed groups, Chavista militias, drug traffickers, Colombian guerrillas who have found refuge in Venezuela won't lay down their arms just because there's a new president in Caracas. Who's going to pay for reconstruction? The United States is already $36 trillion in debt. Will the American Congress vote hundreds of billions in aid to Venezuela when it refuses to fund domestic infrastructure? And who will manage security? The Venezuelan opposition is fragmented, inexperienced, without its own military base. It will depend entirely on American support, which will immediately delegitimize it in the eyes of a large part of the population. We've seen this movie in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Regime change is the easy part. What comes after? Building a functional state, establishing security, creating a viable economy, that's the real challenge. And every time, the United States has failed. Why would it be different in Venezuela? Because Trump is a better president than Bush or Obama? Because his team is more competent? Look around you in Washington and tell me with a straight face that this administration has the capacity, patience, and expertise to manage complex nation building. And beyond Venezuela specifically, there's the broader precedent Trump is establishing. If the United States succeeds in overthrowing Maduro by force or extreme coercion, what message does that send to the rest of the world? That Washington is back in the regime change business. That the post-Iraq era of American restraint is over. That Trump is ready to use American military and economic power to reshape governments he doesn't like. Do you think China will ignore this signal? That Russia will remain passive? Every regional power will intensify its own regime change projects. Beijing will feel justified in being even more aggressive with Taiwan. Moscow will redouble its efforts to destabilize pro-Western governments in Eastern Europe. The fragile international system that emerged after the Cold War, imperfect, certainly, but preferable to total chaos, will disintegrate even faster. And Trump, who claims to defend national sovereignty and oppose globalism, will be the architect of this disintegration. The irony would be comical if it weren't so tragic. The first signs of buyer's remorse are already appearing. Republican senators who supported the hardline are starting to ask embarrassing questions about costs and exit strategies. Pentagon generals are leaking information that they warned against military escalation. Traditional conservative analysts are writing cautious editorials suggesting maybe we should slow down. But it's probably too late. Trump has set in motion a machine he can no longer stop without admitting failure, and we all know he'd rather die than admit a mistake. So he'll double down, triple down, until reality catches up with him in the most painful way possible. In 6 months, maybe a year, when images of Venezuelan refugees fill the screens, when oil prices have climbed, when American Marines are bogged down in Caracas slums, when China has consolidated its influence throughout Latin America, when the midterms approach and the polls are catastrophic. At that moment, Trump will realize the magnitude of his mistake. But it will be too late. Venezuela will have become his Afghanistan. His war he can neither win nor abandon. His political albatross he'll drag until the end of his term. And the saddest thing in all this? It was so predictable. Every serious Latin American expert warned against exactly this scenario. Every lesson from the last 20 years of American foreign policy pointed to this disaster. But Trump doesn't read briefings. He doesn't listen to experts. He follows his instinct and his ego. And now, Venezuela is going to teach him what Iraq taught Bush, what Afghanistan taught Obama and Trump himself during his first term. You don't remake the world with sanctions and military threats. The only thing you get is a disaster bigger than the one you claim to be solving. Venezuela is going to be the defining regret of the Trump 2.0 presidency. Call me in a year. We'll talk about it again.